Welcome to Revival Cycles Tech Talk. I'm Stefan, and today we are talking about the details of the brand new Motogadget M-Unit Blue. We're actually going to get into what all the inputs do, what all the outputs do, and at least some of the features, but honestly, there's way too many to cover, so buckle up. This one is going to be good. The new M-Unit Blue from Motogadget is absolutely unbelievable, and it is so feature rich, it is so well thought out. I'll do my best to cover as much as I can in this video, but understand that there is more. Whatever we cover here is just the tip of the iceberg. You can find so many cool little nuanced features. It'll take the better part of a day of exploring to really master what this thing can do. I'm going to start by just explaining how I've got this little bench set up working. This is a 4-cell anti-gravity battery. That's just a convenient 12-volt source, and I have it connected very simply with just a power wire going to the power input. I have this other one here that I'll use to engage the lock, and then I also have a ground wire, and you'll notice it's sitting on a piece of aluminum that's acting as my ground plane. That's basically the same as what your chassis would be, and that's being grounded through the two mounting bosses on the M-Unit, which need to be grounded. So the way that this circuit is working: power to the M-Unit, ground to the M-Unit, ground to the ground plane through the mounting bosses, just like it would normally be on a motorcycle. Now on the inputs, I've got a bunch of wires just dangling out here. The ends are stripped so that I can connect them to ground to simulate what a push button would look like if you actually had wired this up to a complete handlebar control. I'm doing it in this really simple way because I think it's a little bit clearer than having a bunch of wires spaghettiing all over the place going to a button. Just realize this, tapping this down to the ground plane is the same thing as pushing a button on your handlebars. So with that, we'll start out by going line by line through the inputs. And the first one down here on the bottom is the lock input. The lock input is how you turn the entire system on. So right now, the system is turned off. If I provide positive 12 volts to the lock input, you'll notice all the lights race around, and it stops with, let's put that in a little bit better so it stays on its own. All the lights race around and they stop with the lock input lit, and then also the ignition output lit. So that means the M-Unit is turned on, the ignition system is turned on, but that's it. So no headlight, no taillight, no turn signals, no parking lights, no nothing. It's just on and ready to be started. Well, since we're talking about starting, that's kind of the next input in line, and that is the start input. So if I were to tap the start wire to ground, you see the start input will light, and if I press and hold it, you'll see the starter output also lights up. Now there's a reason that there's this very minor delay between the input and the output, and that's so that you can have multiple functions of that start button. If I double tap the start button, it turned off the ignition. If I now press and start, it turns the ignition back on, and it also turns the headlight on once the start has been activated. The next one in the line is the left turn signal. So very simple. If you connect that to ground, it turns the left turn signal on. Tap to ground again, turns it off. You can also set up in the configurations to have a timed turn signal cancel, so an automatic canceling feature of the turn signal. It's still more complicated than that because it doesn't start the automatic countdown until you are no longer touching the brakes. What that means is as you're coming to a stop sign, you may have your automatic turn signal cancellation set for 30 seconds, but because you're holding the brake light switch while you're sitting at a stoplight signaling your left-hand turn, it will continue to flash that left-hand turn signal until you let go of the brake light, then it'll count down 30, then it'll turn it off. You can also, of course, set it up so there's no countdown and it's just always on until you manually cancel it. The next input is the right-hand turn signal. Same as the left, does all the same stuff, of course. It's just you need to have a left and a right. But the cool part here, if you touch both of them to ground, basically you push both left and right turn signal buttons at the same time, that engages the hazard flasher feature. So now all 4 turn signals are going off at the same time. Very cool. We can see that down here on the outputs. So even though there's nothing actually connected to the output, these are active. If I were to plug a light into this, you would see it start to flash. In fact, I'm going to grab a light so that I can show you that, because you maybe don't believe me, but I'll be right back. Give me a second. Okay, so I went and grabbed one of the supernova lights, and this will basically simulate a tail light for us. And I'm just going to plug this into the right-hand turn signal. And like all my videos, I'm doing this in a totally half-ass and fast way. So when you do it, you need to do it correctly. Look at some of our tutorials on how to do splices and terminations to get that right. All right, so there we go. I've got it grounded, I've got it powered, and as soon as I plug it in, it starts flashing because, well, those outputs are flashing. So if I want to turn them off, I just tap that right-hand input to ground, shuts it off. Again, can turn it back on, flashes. Really, really cool. So that we don't have to watch that light flash for the rest of the video, we'll turn that off. And we can move on to the next one, which is the horn. The horn input on the M-Unit Blue is more than just the horn input. Yeah, it's the horn input. If you push the button, the horn goes off. I don't have one connected, so nothing happens now. But you can see the output LED flashes with the horn output. Now, you'll notice I just tapped that 3 times, and now the left and right turn signals are flashing intermittently. What that means is that you are actually in a calibration mode for the M-Unit to calibrate a speed sensor so that it can monitor the mileage that you're riding on your bike and then transmit that to the app that is on your smartphone, and that will keep track of when you need to do your oil change, when do you need to change your brake pads, how old are your tires, all those kinds of things. Really, really cool. Since I haven't figured out how to exit calibration mode without having a speed sensor connected, because that's something that you do while you're riding, see the manual for the details, I'm going to reset this and we'll continue on from there. Okay, so after the horn, we have a brake light input, and what I'll do is I'll just move the turn signal that we had temporarily connected over to a brake light output. Just kind of jam that in there, and we can connect this to ground. And now, when I tap the brakes, the brake light lights up. Really simple. The inputs just need a ground signal, and that will tell the M-Unit to turn the outputs on. But there is no actual connection. There's no current flowing from the input through the M-Unit to the output. Next up, headlight. This is the headlight control, and again, this has multiple functions. So if you very briefly tap it, it will toggle between low beam to high beam, basically the pass to flash. You know, you want to just get someone's attention, you can quickly just flash the high beam. If you press and hold it for about 1 second, it will actually switch to the high beam. Again, just a quick tap switches it back to the low beam. And if you press and hold it for more than 2 seconds, it will turn the headlight off completely. That's pretty impressive to have that much control of the headlight with just a single momentary push button. Very nice feature. The next input that we've got, I don't have a wire for it because that is the LIN, or the line input, and that's really only used for line bus communication, which is a Motogadget proprietary protocol, and that will interface with specific Motogadget devices that, as far as I can tell, don't actually exist yet. So they're looking forward to the future, and this would be a way that they can communicate between different devices that they're still looking at inventing. Neat stuff, but for now, I guess don't worry about that guy. After the line input, we have the stand input. Stand is for the side stand on the bike, and there's a couple different arrangements of how those switches work. There's a normally closed and a normally open. The good news is they've finally added configurability to that type of an input. So in the configuration menu, you can tell the M-Unit, I have a normally closed side stand switch, I have a normally open side stand switch, and that way it'll work correctly. I think this is one spot where they maybe didn't think it through quite the way that they should have. Right now, the stand switch is set up to limit the engagement of the starter, whereas in my opinion, I think it should also be cutting the power to the ignition. And that's one where if you think about what a side stand switch should be doing when you try to take off in gear with the side stand down, it should turn the engine off. But I guess there's a lot more logic and connections that you would need to make that happen. So they've solved that problem by just making it arranging it so that you can't start the bike when the side stand is in the down position. So you can use that, or you can choose not to use that. You can disable it, you can configure it to match your bike. It's an option, it's handy, and I know that in some countries that's a regulatory requirement for a technical inspection, so now they've made it much easier to integrate that. After the stand, they've got the kill switch. Now, the kill switch is set up so that if you ground the kill switch, it turns off the ignition. Pretty simple. That all makes great sense if you're using momentary push buttons, or if you have like an older dirt bike or CDI type ignition system. But on a lot of the modern street bikes, what you actually have is a normally closed kill switch, meaning the switch is closed when it's in the run position, and that is one thing that they did not make configurable. So in that case, it's going to work backwards from the way that it's marked, or you would need to get a different switch, or you would be able to choose not to use the dedicated kill switch and just rely on the double-click start button to kill the engine. Okay, so far that's a lot of the same stuff with a few minor additions to the original M-Unit V2, if you're familiar with that. That may not have been too much news. Now, what is really new about the M-Unit Blue is they've also added 2 auxiliary inputs and, of course, matching auxiliary outputs. So these can be set up, I have them configured to operate as a momentary switch. So if I connect the auxiliary 1 input to ground, it turns on the auxiliary 1 output. That's great. So momentary push button control of an auxiliary switch, that could be your grip heaters, your GPS, your cell phone charger, I don't know, your radio, or maybe you've got a DVD player on your bike. I hope not. So then to turn it off, all you got to do, press and hold it for about a second, and it'll turn off the auxiliary 1. After that is the last input, and that is auxiliary 2. I have it configured to work the same way as auxiliary 1, momentary push button control, but you can also set these up to engage as soon as the start button is pushed, as soon as the device turns on. You can set them up in a lot of different ways. Check the manual for the details on the different configurations that are available. So that's the rundown on the input side of the M-Unit. That's all the stuff that's going up to your handlebar controls, to your brake light switches, to the ignition switch. But there's one thing I want to circle back to, and that is on that initial input, the lock input. I'm going to disengage that right now. So now that turned the device off. And just for clarity, I'm going to remove that light because we don't need that right now. So right now, the M-Unit is completely turned off, disengaged, and there's no LEDs, nothing's flashing. But I've already paired this with a smartphone. I've got this Samsung Galaxy S7, which is completely foreign to me because I've always been an iPhone guy. But if I go in here and I turn on the Bluetooth, you'll notice after everything syncs up, now that lock input has started to flash. That means that my phone is in proximity of the M-Unit, and the keyless go is actually active. So I can put this phone away, and I'm not doing anything with the app or the phone. All I have to do is walk up to the bike, it's turned off, I tap the start button, and you see the lights race around, and bam, it turns on. That's amazing. Now if I want to start the bike, press and hold, start the bike. Cool. Lights are on, everything's going. Ride around, do what you want to do. When you get where you want to go, it's double click the start button, that killed the engine. Double click it again, that shut down the whole M-Unit. Amazing. Now, if I walk away, and to show you that, I'm just going to turn off the Bluetooth again. It takes just a second for all the signals to wind down. Just bear with me for 1 second. There we go, turned off. So now if I try to start the engine, nothing happens. If I try to turn the bike on, nothing happens. Without that Bluetooth connection, the M-Unit is completely secure. There's nothing you can do to turn it on, short of engaging the physical ignition switch, meaning the lock connection, or you turn your Bluetooth back on or walk back up to your bike and it engages that keyless go feature. Super, super cool. All right, just a quick rundown on what's going on the output side. On the bottom, we start out with the start output. The start output is capable of providing 30 amps. That is an enormous amount of current for a motorcycle application. I don't know that you have many causes to need that, except for maybe the inrush current on a large starter for a Harley, a BMW, or a Moto Guzzi that has the built-in Bendix style starter motor and solenoid package. For the rest of them, the Japanese bikes, when you're dealing with a secondary starter solenoid, those really don't draw very much. But because it can provide 30 amps, they've given you 2 terminals. Each of these small kind of push-to-seat wire terminals can only handle, evidently, 15 amps, so therefore you need 2 of them to provide the full 30 amps. If you have a Harley, BMW, Moto Guzzi, or anything with that Bendix style starter, maybe you're installing this in a hot rod, you need to use both terminals for the start output so that you have the correct amperage flowing through both of those and you can get the full power out. Once you go to the next output, that's the left-hand turn signal, and that is just a single output because it's able to provide 10 amps. So that's perfectly under the ratings, and that should be enough to provide 120 watts of power for your entire left-hand turn signal arrangement. Most of those lights are going to be 25 watts, so you've got plenty of room. You can have 4 of those lights plugged in with no problem. After that, right-hand turn signal, same thing, nothing special there. Horn, same thing, you just plug the positive side of the horn into that output, ground the other side, and then when you push the horn input, the horn goes off. Imagine that. Brake. Now the brake output is a little bit interesting because it can be configured to do more than just turn the brake light on and off. It can also be configured for what's called a one-wire tail light, and that means if you have a dual filament tail light, meaning you've got the tail light and then a separate filament for the brake light, you can actually wire both of those together and run both of those into the brake output, and that allows you to pulse width modulate so that the combination, both filaments will be turned on and they'll just be half bright because it's only turning the output on half the time. Then when you actually tap the brake switch, it will turn them on full bright so they're on full power. So it doesn't sound like much, but when you're actually wiring the bike, it's really just simple. It's a lot easier, and it really comes in handy if you're using LED lights because, like this light right here, only has 2 wires, a ground and a positive. So there's no provision for a tail light. What this means with the one-wire tail light, I can just plug it in normally, and the M-Unit will automatically dim this to 50% brightness as a tail light, and then when I need it, it'll kick it up to full brightness as a brake light. Additionally, with the brake light, you can configure the brake light modulator, meaning you can have different flashing and pulses that come with it to get more attention so that no one runs into you from behind. And that's something that is your choice, and you can configure that either through the manual configuration going through doing wire taps, or you can also just hook up to a smartphone and do all the configurations conveniently in English or your favorite language right there on the phone. So after the brake light output, there's the low beam output. They've labeled it just as light, but because the one above that is high beam, obviously the one below it is low beam. There's not a lot to these. You plug the low beam in the low beam, and you plug the high beam in the high beam, and then ground the headlight itself. That's all there is. The M-Unit will take care of switching between the low beam and the high beam. It's worth noting for those guys that have dual headlights, it does switch between low beam to high beam, meaning if the high beam is on, the low beam is off. If the low beam is on, the high beam is off. If you want to have the functionality where on high beam both lights are on, you're going to need to get creative. You may need to solve that problem using a relay or a diode, but that's one that's going to be up to you. There's not a good way to configure this at this time. After the high beam output, there is the ignition output. And this is a really nice addition that is new on the M-Unit Blue. It used to be that you had to power everything from the auxiliary, and that didn't really make sense, and it was just kind of weird. But now they've got a dedicated ignition output. So this is where you would wire the power for the ignition system for the engine, and that should be done basically the same as it was on the stock bike or following the instructions on your aftermarket ignition system. But wherever it says connect to switched 12-volt power, or wherever it was connected to the kill switch or the ignition switch, that now gets connected to that ignition output. The next after the ignition output is the auxiliary 1. And again, that is just an auxiliary. You can configure this to do different things. You can have it set up to power your grip heaters or your GPS or your radio or who knows, whatever. Maybe you need to have a blender on your bike. I don't know. That would be used for powering that. After that, auxiliary 2. Same thing. You can do lots of different things with it. You can change the way that it behaves in the configuration menu. So maybe it powers on as soon as the bike powers on. Maybe it powers on after you started the bike. Maybe it powers on when you tell it to turn on. And you can either use a toggle switch or a momentary contact switch, depending on how you set up that configuration. Check out the details in the manual. There's just too much to cover absolutely everything on this device. There is so much that the M-Unit Blue can do, and we're really only just dealing with the hardware right now, and we kind of talked a little bit about the software. We're going to do another video about the app and what that can do, but right now what I'm going to do is take J63 apart, install this really quickly, and then show you how this all works in an actual application to help you get a better idea of what it's like to actually live with the M-Unit Blue.